But in Top Focus on tonight's show is a special conversation. Now, many say the biggest socio-economic challenge for the country is to create jobs, and that's because every year nearly 13 million people are joining the workforce every year, or more than 1 million every month. So how is the government fared in creating jobs? Can startups create jobs on a big scale? And what will be the impact of automation on jobs? Ronajoy caught up with Manish Sabharwal of TeamLease and Suraj Saharan of Delivery on all these issues.
Well, thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us here on CNBC TV 18. Suraj, let me start with you. You know, the jobs has been a big war cry for this government. And, you know, while India at one level is celebrating the growth of the startup culture, many are also voicing concerns whether startups can really create jobs at the end of the day. How do you look at this?
I think the startups can create jobs. It's not about whether startups can create. I think what is needed is a better environment for that can be provided by the government for creating these jobs. Now, as a startup, if you employ a certain number of people, the moment you exceed a certain number of people, there are a lot of laws that become applicable to you as an organization. And so it sort of intimidates a lot of the startups who've just sort of began their journey, because it's a lot of administrative overhead that comes along with it. So I don't think the question is of whether startups can provide jobs.
But
I think
in terms of scale.
Yeah. So look, I think any startup that's growing will need people, and whether they're able to take those people on roll and provide them a full-time sort of job depends on how the environment is. If the environment is conducive and helps them do that easily, why would they not provide the jobs?
Mr. Sabharwal, you've been writing for many years about this environment, where you famously or infamously called it the regulatory cholesterol. Since this government has come to power, clearly labor laws has been an area where they have tried to address it, and for the first time in years. Overall, how would you rate the government's performance as far as improving the environment, as Suraj was talking about?
No, I mean, I think we've done more labor reform in the last 2 years than in the 20 years before that. But obviously, a lot of it is around plumbing issues, around trying to go paperless, around trying to go presence-less. I think an important move has been giving the power to amend central laws to states. So Rajasthan amended 4 laws, Madhya Pradesh has now amended 9, Maharashtra is amending 19. So because there's no such thing as India's land and labor market, there may be some such thing as India's capital market. So 29 chief ministers matter more than one prime minister. And I think China's genius wasn't some Ayatollah in Beijing issuing fatwas, it was mayors competing for investment. So I think recognizing that India is 29 different labor markets, making progress on labor laws has been important progress, though you have to see it in the context of the fact that the labor markets are linked to issues like urbanization. They are linked to ease of doing business. They are linked to manufacturing. They are linked to skilling. They are linked to school reform. So I would say that they've made good progress on the labor law. I think now is the time to move faster.
Therefore, it cannot be seen in isolation, is essentially what you're saying, because it's linked to many other factors.
Well, the government is organized vertically, but jobs are horizontal. See, that's why everybody struggles with jobs, because the government is organized vertically. There's every minister or secretary who looks at their area, but jobs, finally, an entrepreneur, the role of the government is not to set things on fire, it is to create the conditions for spontaneous combustion. So if you reduce regulatory cholesterol, if you improve infrastructure and urbanization, and if you do human capital, that's what we need. Make in India isn't about going back to industrial policy by offering subsidies to shoemakers or light industries. It is about letting every entrepreneur in India not deal with the regulatory cholesterol and focus on the market and raising capital and attracting talent.
You know, this government, Suraj, has been called as one that focuses a lot on ideas, and you know, and every time you hear the Prime Minister speak, in fact, he was on our channel very recently, and he again spoke about, you know, his vision in terms of turning the economy around. And if labor laws have to be, you know, have to choke, you know, innovation, at least in the way in which we've seen in the last 20 years or so, you know, you're on ground, and you're one of the more popular entrepreneurs. Give us some of the on-ground problems that, you know, that delivery has had to face owing to this sort of regulatory cholesterol that Mr. Sabharwal was talking about.
I think the problem is twofold. One is the existence of these laws and the need to be compliant with all of them. The other is because there are so many of them, not knowing which laws apply to you. So we've had a number of issues of the latter kind, where when we were sort of much younger and 1 year into the business, we wouldn't even know which laws apply to us. And so at some point we would have an inspector or an officer of a particular department sort of walk in and say, hey, by the way, you don't have this. And we tell him, like, that we did not even know that this is applicable to us. In some cases, when we found out that there are certain laws that are applicable, we've gone back and filed whatever needed to be filed along with a penalty as well. And in fact, the government is at least being receptive of these problems from the startup community. I was in one of the panels with Mrs. Nirmala Sitharaman, where she'd called up startups to understand what issues they face. And this is the exact point I had made to her, where I said, look, when people start out, they're not fully well aware of what applies to them. So can we have a 3-year or a 5-year sort of window where, as and when people find out the applicability of certain laws, we should be able to go back in time and pay without penalties or any recourse from the authorities. But those kind of incidents are many. Just picking out one of them wouldn't make sense. These happen very frequently and happen too many times because of all the laws. And it's not just labor. This is various other registrations that you need to do as an organization.
In fact, this reminds me of what you had famously said, that you cannot possibly follow 100% of the laws without breaking 10% of them, because, the level of awareness about this convoluted sort of labor law structure is so complex that it's hard to know for an entrepreneur. I mean, he may know about the tax laws, not necessarily the labor laws.
So the way to do this is, first of all, move to a unique enterprise number like Aadhaar. See, we have 27 different numbers as a company: ESI number, PF number, TAN number, PIN number, LAN number. Let's get rid of all these and move to a universal enterprise number, and then use that universal enterprise number to move to an 18-month vision of the India stack, which is paperless, presenceless and cashless. All 44 central laws and the 3 important state laws in every state should move to being paperless. Today, corporate India uses 500 crore sheets of paper. 6 lakh trees every year get chopped because of stupid A4, A3, duplicate, triplicate. So move to paperless, move to presenceless, which will reduce corruption, and move to cashless so you can move to online remittance. So I think this is a plumbing problem. I think there are broader philosophy questions in labor laws around Chapter 5B of the Industrial Disputes Act, which is iron fire. We can come to that later. At least sort out the regulatory cholesterol around paperless, presenceless, cashless and single identity number. That, to my mind, will be a very important debottlenecking for entrepreneurs. As entrepreneurs, there are 2 kinds of companies you can create: a baby and a dwarf. Both are small, but the baby is going to grow, the dwarf is going to stay there. Corporate India is mostly dwarfs. We have 6.3 crore enterprises. Only 18,000 of them have a paid-up capital of 10 crores. So if we want more babies, we have to start with the regulatory cholesterol in labor laws.
What were your suggestions then when you were part of that roundtable with the minister? What were some of the suggestions that came not just from you, but your peers in the community?
So obviously the one thing I spoke about was the fact that there should be a window where any entrepreneur should be allowed to go back and correct any of the registrations or the compliances that were needed as and when they find out. So, and they shouldn't be penalized while they do that. The other ones, there were specific sort of issues related to the biochem industry, where people wanted the process of filing patents to be simplified. There were issues related to the telecom industry, where one of the startups had a problem in the past, and they wanted a clearer sort of definition of what qualifies as wrong versus right. But mostly were around easing of the laws and the availability of a central repository where anyone who starts out can quickly look up and say which laws and which regulations apply to them. And also having a tiered system for regulatory compliance. So maybe in the first year of operations, any company will only have to comply with 5 laws to begin with, which are the absolute essential ones. The next year onwards, you start sort of needing to comply with a lot many more laws, because as a company grows, it also learns naturally in the process, right? And so 10 years down the line, if you ask me to comply with 50 laws, I may not have such a big problem. But in the first year, if you ask me to do that, a lot of entrepreneurs don't start out because they're so afraid of being able to manage all of this. But
labor law is one of them.
Labor law is obviously one of them.
Intimidating to...
There are many laws that apply to labor, so many of them, yeah.
It's just a complex web of... Okay, finally I want to get both you gentlemen on this other rather burning issue, which is globally is being talked about. What will be the impact of greater automation on manufacturing jobs, especially at a time when we are seeing manufacturing plants largely depending on robots, at least for the mundane activities. There's a fear that even some of the complex work will now be carried out by the robots. In such a situation, with about 13 million people joining the workforce on an annual basis in India, what does it mean for a country like ours?
It doesn't really mean much because 50% of our labor force anyway is only producing 10% of our GDP. See, we have 240 million people in agriculture, which is half our labor force, but they only produce 1/10 of GDP. So they are already at so low productivity that this kind of, the automation robot argument, I think is a little far from India because of, we're not at the technology frontier. You know, our labor force is so far behind. We're close to marginal productivity of 0 for 240 million people. So I don't think that automation for India, particularly, and a large part of India's domestic economy is driven by domestic consumption and services. Those are much harder to automate than manufacturing. So I think it's clear that we don't have the same manufacturing opportunity that China had in 1978. They were, before automation, the global growth was in a super cycle, global trade was leading to more openness. So I think for India we have to keep an eye on that, but I think in the next during the period of our demographic dividend, which is really 10 lakh kids joining the labor force every month for the next 10 years. I don't think in the period of demographic dividend we really have to think about automation as our binding constraint. Our binding constraint is regulatory cholesterol.
But then don't you fear that somewhere that at least the number of manufacturing jobs that may have been available 5 years down the line, at least in the same proportion, may not be available 10 years down the line?
Only 11% of India works in manufacturing. That is the same as post-industrial United States. It makes no sense. 28% of China works in manufacturing. At peak, 33% of China used to work. At peak, 45% of UK used to work in manufacturing. So I'm not saying we'll ever get to 45 or 30, but 11% is the wrong number. So Make in India is not about getting to 30% of our labor force in manufacturing. It's about getting to 15-20%, which is another 100 million jobs anyway.
Well, Suraj, final word to you then. How do you look at this debate, automation versus jobs?
See, I think, I don't know when it was, but Mr. Raghuram Rajan had explained the economy using the dosa as an example. And he had exactly talked about this, where he said, as you get more and more automation into the system, what changes is that people start doing more productive jobs. It doesn't take away the job. It changes what they're doing. But and that's what will happen. Automation is not replacing jobs. What will happen is people will start doing different, more productive tasks that will overall increase the productivity of the workforce. So nothing to fear there, I would say.
Thank you so much for your time. Thank you very much. Thank you.